Now I have an interesting statistic. 70% of student travelers come from middle to upper income households. Now, compare that with the fact that 79% of HISD students come from economically disadvantaged families. That means that it's very likely that many HISD students will never travel abroad.
Which is why HISD's partnerships with AFS USA, the Pernick Foundation, EF Educational Tours, and the Amigos de las Americas is so critical. Together, we're expanding equity of access to some of the most exclusive and impactful learning opportunities.
Our next guest speaker will talk to us more about these numbers. She has over 25 years of experience traveling abroad with students, and the experience has afforded her a unique perspective.
Just like before, there will be a brief Q&A afterward. You can submit your questions in the Q&A chat box or raise your hand by clicking the hand icon to ask your question. We'll turn on your mic so you can ask your question directly to our guest speaker. We want to hear your voice.
And now, it is my personal privilege to present a woman with the title of President. Please welcome President of the Denver Public Schools Board of Education, Dr. Carrie Olson.
Thank you so much for that wonderful welcome, Boris and Van. It is an honor to be here today. Thank you so much to EF Tours, to Chelsea Mercer and Jenny Williams. Thank you to Kian Zaire for organizing all of this. And thank you to all of the students and panelists who are here today. It's really inspiring to hear from all of you and hear the student speeches. I think our future is in great hands. My name is Dr. Carrie Olson, and I taught in Denver Public Schools for 33 years. 25 of those, as Van mentioned, were spent traveling with over 800 students. And during that time when I was traveling, my brain started thinking, what am I seeing about education? Sort of back to John's point about what is that education that we don't seem to be learning in a book or don't seem to be testing? What are students learning, and what can I learn from what my students are learning about traveling outside of the classroom? We travel to Washington, D.C. and Europe every year with students. And so from that curiosity and talking to my students, I decided to get my PhD to research that. And it's one of the most meaningful things I've done in my life. And I understand that after this webinar, after this symposium, you're going to be getting my webinar that delves into my research. But I'm going to give you a little bit of the overview of my research right now, just so you can get an idea of some of the highlights from some of my students that I'd like to call out today. And I'd like to thank you for your interest in educational travel. Now more than ever, I think it's important for us to be able to be thinking about global issues, and we are all global citizens, as Jocelyn just mentioned, and what we do with that being global citizens is really important. I'd also like to thank all of my former students with whom I traveled, especially America, Lucas, Angelina, Kim, Elliot, Camila, Lilac, Laura, and Beto, who you're going to hear me talk a little bit about today. So what I did when I decided to look at what is the meaning of educational travel, I looked at quantitative research. So what that means is I looked at what is happening with test scores, with attendance, with suspensions, with graduations, with GPAs. What did all of those numbers mean? Because being a teacher, I knew that if I didn't look at data, nobody was going to listen to me in our data-rich culture. But then I knew that I didn't want it just to be based on data, because my students in my low-income inner-city school in Denver were always being judged by the data and always being told what they couldn't do based on their test scores, attendance rates, and their income status. And I saw something different in my students. So then I followed that up with a qualitative part where I interviewed my 9 students. And what they told me about education really, and education and travel, has really changed how I think about how we educate our students. And it's really important to note too, there's a lot of research being done that if students don't get a chance to travel when they're in middle or high school, they are less likely to travel when they're in college or actually travel at all in their adult lives. So I think it's really important for all of us here today who are thinking about some form of travel with students before they graduate to think about how can we help students. And of course, my lens comes from a culturally responsive point of view. I based a lot of my work on Geneva Gay, and Zaretta Hammond, Lisa Delpit, Gloria Lodson-Billings, Sonia Nieto. If you haven't read any of those authors, I highly recommend them. They give a lot of great ideas. So what I did is I took a lot of their ideas about how to make educational travel, or how to make education culturally responsive, and I added an overlay of educational travel based on my trips. And what I'd like to do today is share with you some of the words from some of my students. One of the things that my students told me, all 9 of them when I interviewed them, is they felt like they did better in school because of travel, and travel made them want to read more. This was resounding across all of the interviewees that I had. They said because they knew, for example, they were going to go to Washington, D.C., they were more likely to pick up a book to read about Washington, D.C., and they thought that that then helped them increase their vocabulary, increase their reading levels, and increase their academic knowledge of the world. Many of them said that they got excited to read about, for example, the Louvre in Paris or the Eiffel Tower, and understand a little bit more about the history. So then when they were more engaged in wanting to read, it carried over into all areas of their life. They started thinking, what does school have for me? Some of them said even through high school, they remembered that lesson they learned in middle school of wanting to read something and recognizing that school had that for them, that it wasn't something that was outside. In fact, America said that was a validation for her, that she recognized that when she worked really hard to understand something, she could see how much her schooling was increasing. Another one of my participants, Camila, says that travel changed the trajectory of her life. And this was something that I heard over and over again. She said that she believed because she traveled to Washington, D.C., she scored higher than what was expected of the students in her neighborhood. She felt like travel educated her on so many topics, inspired her to read more, similar to what she reported for everything related to travel. Except for science. She said that, and this is another thing a lot of my students said, is that they didn't feel a connection to their science teachers through middle school, so they didn't have that same level of wanting to understand as much as they did for reading, writing, and social studies. As far as their grade point averages, one of my students, Camila, said that she thought that the grade point averages were higher throughout middle school and high school because the students who traveled understood how to plan for something for their future. They understood that travel doesn't just mean you show up and you go on a trip, but you think about something for your future. You think about how you're going to get there, and that it's all something we all do together. And having adults who support you was really important for a lot of my travelers. And for all of the teachers watching today and all the adults involved in travel, I can't overemphasize that. Many of my students said that they could hear adults' voices even in high school a couple years after they had traveled with our chaperones in middle school. They heard them saying, you need to get going on this, you need to keep working. And they realized that they had people who would support them, and they were more likely to talk with some of their teachers as well. Students who travel are also more likely to just feel engaged in learning overall. Some of them talked about they felt like they could talk to adults better because they had gotten to know some adults on the trip. So when they were in high school, they felt more like they could approach their teachers. One of my students, Elliot, said that he started thinking, hey, there might be something to learn at school today. And I think that goes a little bit to what John was saying in his presentation, that sometimes learning in school feels a little disconnected from what students really want to learn. But a lot of my travelers said that because of the trips, they felt like they could show up and there was going to be something that was there for them to learn, and that they were connected to something bigger than themselves. One boy said that he did not want to learn anything about art. He didn't want to go to the art museum in Washington, D.C., but a lot of us chaperones on the trip pushed kids to try and do something that was a little bit out of their comfort zone. And he said he liked it so much that when he was in Paris, he wanted to go to the Louvre and he wanted to see art, and he wanted to go to the Pompidou Center, and he wanted to see how art had changed. And now he works in a billboard company, putting up billboard signs across the city. And he says he talks to his fellow co-workers about the aesthetics of billboards across the city, and it gives him a sense of empowerment to be able to have that. A lot of my students also said that they were empowered by the trips, and it gave them a desire to graduate. She said Lilac especially talked about how travelers worked harder at everything because they recognized that they had the confidence and the agency to make their dreams come true after having it done so for the trips. Coming from a neighborhood where everybody was at or below the poverty line, they recognized that it was a family venture to be able to work all together to make the trips happen. And they recognized that once you come together, there's a power in the collective and a power of the family to be able to make things happen. And they remembered that, especially in high school when things got tough. An interesting thing is some of my travelers tended to get suspended at a higher rate than students who didn't travel. And a lot of them talked about they just felt so empowered from traveling across the nation or to Europe that they had an increase in confidence and they had an increase in thirst for knowledge and what was being offered in high school. And when they didn't find that, or they didn't find the connection that they had in middle school, they felt disengaged, and then they ended up either acting out or not going to school as much, and truancy at that time led to more suspensions. Another one of my students mentioned that it led him to think about new ideas. And with those new ideas, he started getting what he called brain food. And he said that all of this brain food helped his learning just sort of start to fall together as he learned a little bit of something here, a little bit of something here, things he never thought that he would want to learn about before, how the government works not only in the United States, but in Europe. And then he felt that it all started to come together, but because he had been exposed to all of this. And I touched a little bit on this briefly, but it was so much, oops, and I know that's my 10 minutes. I set a timer for myself, but it's really important to think about the families. I know our very first speaker talked about how when she first talked to her family about traveling, she said, oh, it didn't go poorly. But a lot of my students, when they first talked to their family about traveling, it did go poorly, and their families didn't want them to travel in the beginning. So we made it a family affair when we held meetings for the trips. We served food. We had it in all the languages. I'm fluent in Spanish, so we would translate the meetings. If we had Vietnamese speakers or Somali, we made sure that we had translators there to be able to welcome the families in their native language and answer all their questions. And I think it's really important for all of us to remember that all of us here today are being called upon by the students who are present, by my participants in this trip, to create a more just and equitable world of travelers. From my 9 students, I learned so much about how to make equity and travel a reality. And it's up to us, the leaders of student travel, to create a place where students, like one of my students, Laura, says, you asked me to go and I felt welcome to go. Nobody had ever asked me before. How many Lauras are we missing by not asking? Where students such as my student Lucas can make these connections to learning and have the confidence to say, I understand this. We're rebellious students. I think one of my students, Camila, was so rebellious, and she took all of her energy to make her dream to stand at the top of the Eiffel Tower come true. And other students, like my former student Kim, who only had 1 pair of shoes a year, and it was her dream to be able to travel, and she ended up going on 2 different trips. It's up to us to pack our bags with all of the tools that we know how to do and help students be able to travel far. So I know my time is up, so I'm ready to take some questions.
Thank you, Dr. Olson. And the first question that we have here is from Rafael Sarango. He says, how do we best approach the equity and accessibility to travel, especially for those students who need it most, not only the quote unquote good students?
That's a great question. In fact, a lot of my travelers were what other teachers would have called rebels without a cause. And I think one of my students, Laura, was a great example of that. In fact, when I went to the student advisor and said I wanted to travel with Laura, he said I was out of my mind, that I wasn't going to get her to the corner. So I think the most important thing is to offer it to everybody who you think might like to travel and the ones you think might not. One of the things that we did from the very beginning is we said we will never create barriers such as GPA, your grade point average, attendance or suspensions rates, a barrier to travel. So if kids came to us and they were not doing well in school or they had behavior problems, we sat down and talked to them and talked to their families and talked about what's your dream and how can we help you. Adult advocates who get to know children and create that strong relationship and get to know their families is the best way to do it. So think outside the box. Some of my best travelers on the trips when things didn't go well were some of my students who were rebellious at school, and some of my worst travelers were the kids who had straight A's and were the gifted and talented students because they always wanted things to be a certain way. Not always true, but I think it's really important to keep your mind open and encourage students.
Thank you, Dr. Olson. We have one more question. It's from Anonymous. What advice can you give to a person who is kind of scared to leave their family and study abroad?
So that's also a great question, because a lot of that happened to a lot of my students. They would say, I'm afraid, I'm actually scared. And I would use the quote, do one thing a day that scares you. And I would remind my students of how many people have gone before them. And I would also tell them, think of the last time you did something that you didn't think you would be able to do, and you did it. What skills did you use to help yourself overcome that? So think about challenging yourself. Look inside yourself. This is your life. This is your dreams out there. Go get it. Like, you need to look at what do you really want for your life and challenge yourself. Also, don't ever underestimate the power of talking to your teachers, your parents, your counselors, anybody who you have as a trusted adult, even some of your friends. Some of my students were deathly afraid to travel, but they also had that wanderlust inside of you. You all know on this call what I'm talking about, because you're all here because of travel, right? You see a picture or you watch a travel video and you're like, I'm going there next. If that's your dream, think of times that you were afraid to do something and what did you do to overcome that, and apply that to your travel. I also would like to say that at the end of my webinar, I have all of my information if you'd like to connect with me more, ask me more questions. I know we don't have a lot of time today, but I love talking about travel and I love talking about my students. And it's so fun now. A lot of my students are on Facebook and they're older, and we talk a lot about what travel continues to mean for them as they marry and have children and travel with their own kids. It's a cycle that keeps repeating.
Thank you very much, Dr. Olson.